Welcome, everybody. First item of business is request for bill introductions. Do we have any requests? Seeing none, the second item of business was approval of minutes. Yesterday I announced, I think it was February 25th. Did everyone have a chance to review those minutes, and are there any corrections? If not, I would entertain a motion to adopt the minutes. Representative Long for a motion, and a second by Representative Essex. Any discussion, committee? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. Now, committee, we'll turn our attention to House Bill 2396, and for an overview on that, I'd turn to the reviser, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2096 would authorize the use of a protest petition to limit funding of a taxing jurisdiction by property tax revenues above a certain amount. It would establish the acknowledging stewardship of tax revenue and appropriations, otherwise known as the ASTRA fund. It would authorize certain transfers from the state general fund, which would then authorize transfers from the state general fund to be divvied up between qualified cities and counties, and would eliminate the revenue neutral rate requirements and by taxing subdivisions and the taxpayer notification cost fund. Under Section 1 of the bill, all taxing subdivisions except for school districts in the state of Kansas will be subject to a protest petition if the governing body adopted an appropriation or budget whereby the property tax revenues exceed the prior years plus the CPI adjustment and any revenue attributed to new construction or improvements. In the event that 10% or more voters from the prior election sign the protest petition, the taxing jurisdiction would be limited to property tax revenues equal to the prior year plus CPI and new construction property tax revenues. So essentially, if a protest petition is filed with a substantive number of signatures, the taxing jurisdiction will be limited to the property tax revenue plus CPI plus new construction. If the protest petition would fail or there would be no protest petition, the taxing jurisdiction would be able to levy the property tax for the amount of revenue sought. Copies of any available protest petitions will be available in the county treasurer for all taxing jurisdictions located in the county. An additional provision is that the protest petition provisions would not apply in any year in which a transfer provided in Section 2 was not made. Under Section 2, this would provide for the yearly transfer from SGF in the amount of $60 million to the ASTRA fund, which is created in this bill. There would also be an increase after the first year of the amount of 2% on top of $60 million, so the amount would increase. Cities and counties in the state would be eligible for a disbursement from the fund if they do not exceed the tax revenues from the prior year plus CPI adjustments and any increases in new construction for their budgets. According to the allocation formula in the formula, the state treasurer would allocate essentially to each county based on 65% of the amount to be distributed shall be apportioned on the basis of the population figures of the counties. And then the second component would be 35% of such amount shall be apportioned on the basis of the equalized assessed tangible valuations on the tax rolls of the counties on November 1st of the preceding year, as certified by the director of PBD. The county and each city contained within the county would receive a portion of the allocated based on the ratio of property taxes levied by the county and the property taxes levied by any cities located within the county, and that any amounts not transferred would be returned to the state general fund. Lastly, under sections 3 through 5 in the repealer, this would remove and eliminate the provisions and requirements that currently exist dealing with the revenue neutral rate and the taxpayer notification cost fund. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Adam. I just wanted to ask a quick question. This bill does not, it creates the fund, but it does not make the appropriation. We will still have to account for that in the budget. Is that correct?
I mean, unless another substantive provision would be made in the budget, I believe the transfer would occur.
Okay.
Because this makes a $60 million transfer.
And it does, being a demand transfer, it happens automatically.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Committee, any questions? Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Adam, for that. On a demand transfer, does that demand transfer go into perpetuity every year? Will that continue on?
Unless otherwise another provision or later law would be enacted, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And, yeah, and I just wanted to make a quick comment. If that transfer isn't made, it's kind of a, I don't know if you call it a severance clause or not, but there's a provision in the bill that says if that transfer is not made by the state legislature, the protest petition and all the other provisions are not valid. So kind of holds the legislature accountable for making that transfer to local governments. Representative Carlin.
So this sounds a lot like the LAVTR, the way it's written, except for the demand transfer is automatically given. Am I just off base on that, just as a quick read?
It sounds like the opposite. The LAVTR and the CCRSF and the special city county highway funds, those demand transfers were all automatic. This
But
one
they
is.
were subject to appropriation because we didn't appropriate.
Yes. Well, yes,
So
they're
that's
subject to
I
proviso.
guess that's the part I'm asking, does it correct that?
It doesn't correct that, except with the provision that I just explained to Representative Hoheisel. If the legislature does not make that appropriation, the local governments are not subject to that protest petition any longer.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is it also, if the legislature does not make the appropriation, does the revenue neutral rate parts still stay away, or do they come back if we do not?
No, they are repealed. Representative Corbett.
Thank you, Chairman. So in this, when you have the revenue neutral the way it is now, there's no state dollars coming in for anything, correct? It's just, you're just working out that with your county people? And this bill, if it's not revenue neutral, is the state supposed to come in and make whole what's not right? Is that the way you're telling me?
I couldn't understand you exactly, but you might try to ask your question
What
again.
I'm asking, the way the neutral rate is right now, if you want to protest the neutral rate, you can just do it. And with this bill, if the counties exceed the neutral rate or not, does the state of Kansas come in and backfill what they're short, or how am I getting? Nope.
No.
Okay.
And I'll tell the committee, I have a kind of a summary too, that after Adam gets done, you'll have the other Adam get up and I'll answer some questions too. So you might want to save some of your questions for me. Are there any further questions for the reviser? Okay, seeing none, I'll trade you place. I'll turn it over to Chairman Turner.
All right, thank you, actual chairman. So our first proponent will be Oh, you're not a proponent. Oh, our first presenter will be Representative Adam Smith.
I don't want to skew things. I'm neither proponent, neutral, or opposition. I just wanted to give a chance to explain kind of how this bill originated, where it came from. So thank you, Representative Turner. Property tax, the problem with property taxes didn't happen overnight. That's not going to get solved overnight. It also didn't happen. You can't point your finger at any one person or one body. We kind of all have a responsibility. The state legislature, we continue to impose mandates that are either unfunded or underfunded on local governments. There are services that are provided at the local level that we either tell them they have to provide, or by rules and regs, we give mandates on how they have to be provided, but we don't provide any revenue to offset that. So that burden falls directly on the local taxes, mostly property taxes. Also local governments, you've heard the comments that most of the mill levy goes toward local governments. It's supporting your cities, your counties, your townships, all of your local taxing jurisdictions. The state portion of that is actually relatively small. We have the statutory levy of 20 mills for schools. That if you look at your tax statement, it actually looks like it's going to the school general fund, but that is a state statutory levy that we have put in place in statute. The state also has their 1.5 mills. But the burden also is on the local governments to manage their budgets and their tax increases responsibly as well. But included in that is also the taxpayers. Taxpayers often have the option to vote on certain bond elections, whether it's for a school or a hospital or whatever might be going into your community. It's important, but we also need to understand as taxpayers, every one of us in the room is probably a taxpayer in some form or another. Those decisions have consequences too. We vote on that because we want it, and sometimes we may not really realize and understand the impact when it comes time to pay those property taxes. Also, the elected officials, they are voted on by the voters. A lot of times, I've voted for elected officials that didn't really do things the way I thought they should before, but it's up to me to kind of hold them accountable as well. But this bill really kind of started a couple years ago when we had some conversations about the LAVTR, as Representative Carlin had mentioned. We had several demand transfers that were on the books that were not funded. We also had several conversations about the revenue neutral rate, and I was trying to figure out a way to kind of merge those together. How do we create some incentive to provide all the services? Local governments, state government, we're all in the same business. We're providing essential services to our citizens. So how can we work together to create kind of cooperative tax relief here? So what happened, I was working on some ideas, and I apologize for the lateness in the session that this bill is coming up. When we originally started working our 1.5 mills, House Bill 2011, I think is what it was, we kicked that out pretty early. Then that didn't really go anywhere, so I started looking at this as an option. I've been in conversations with the Department of Revenue, the State Treasurer's Office, the League of Kansas Municipalities, the Kansas Association of Counties, several county commissioners and county treasurers and county clerks, because they all have a hand in how this happens. This legislation and the revenue neutral rate and the LAVTR, it all impacts all of them. So in the spirit of having those conversations, it's taken a while, and I've got to give tremendous kudos to Mr. Siebers, the reviser. He has exercised an exorbitant amount of patience with me as I have those conversations, and I'll tell him one thing one night, and then the next day I'll come back and say, nope, we're going to go back and do it the other way. So ultimately, that's how this bill came about. I've made some remarks that I've put in my my summary there. One of the things I wanted to address was repealing the revenue neutral rate. Kind of around, in statute, it's referred to as the revenue neutral rate, but it kind of came about as this phrase, truth in taxation. We want to make sure the public understands their values, their mill levies. The complaint, I think, mostly that was spoken about when we adopted Senate Bill 13 in March of 21, I think, was, a lot of these local governments are holding their mill levy the same and saying they're not increasing property taxes, which isn't true. As your valuation goes up, the mill levy, the tax rate stays the same. That is an increase in taxes. So there was this phrase that was talked about called truth in taxation. And I want to make it clear that even though House Bill 2396 does repeal the revenue neutral policy, in my mind, it really enhances the idea behind truth in taxation. I think the revenue neutral law worked. It gave a voice to the people to go into those revenue neutral hearings and exercise their voice, but they really didn't have any teeth. I heard lots of stories of folks that would go into those hearings and kind of complain about the property taxes, but yet the local government still adopted the budget. So this piece here gives that that same voice to the people. They can still go into these budget hearings and express their concern with the budget. And then if the government goes ahead and adopts that budget, gives them the option to come in and put a stop to any excessive increases. The truth in taxation under this bill also has a much higher potential for property tax savings. I had legislative research run the numbers for me, and if this law would have been in place, 2396 would have been in place when we had adopted Senate Bill 13 and the revenue neutral rate, it would have resulted in another $139.3 million of property tax relief above and beyond what the revenue neutral rate. So if revenue neutral rate has worked, we don't know what our taxes would be right now if revenue neutral had not been in place, but we do know what it is. If this had been in place, it's an additional property tax savings to the people. As I mentioned to Representative Hoheisel, the other part of truth in taxation is it also holds the legislature accountable. We have to fund that demand transfer. If we don't, our citizens will lose the ability to protest those tax increases. And if they get used to doing that and having that option, all of a sudden that's ripped away. We have to be cognizant of that. No matter what shape the state budget is in, we have to make sure that we fund that, or we're going to be accountable to our voters too. But Mr. Vice Chairman, I'll be happy to stand for questions if there's any further questions about the bill.
All right, thank you for your comments. Representative Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, and thank you, Chairman, for this. I like kind of the broad shape of this. I think it's well thought out for the most part. I do have a couple of concerns, and maybe you can address them. The first one is the tying it to the CPIU. Municipalities don't buy consumer goods, and then so for me, I wonder. I don't know if there exists like a municipal price index or something like that that we might consider.
There is, and actually that's how the bill started out when we began drafting it. But there is not a Midwest adjustment for that. The municipal index is nationwide, and plus, if you look at the numbers, it actually trends lower than CPI historically, and just with the regional ability of CPI to kind of adjust for the Midwest region, and the fact that it's actually a little bit higher and it allows for some more growth, I decided to go with the CPI. But you're exactly right. There is a municipal index, and originally I thought that was probably the best route to go. But
thank you. And if I can have one more. For me, I guess the biggest concern for me is that just kind of looking at my kind of local politics overall, it's pretty toxic right now. And I think 10% is just a really low threshold in order to do this. I've tinkered around with ideas of maybe like 20% or maybe even, I don't know how we would do this, but 50% plus one of the most recent mayoral election. I mean, to stop a budget is a pretty big thing, I think. And so to at least get enough people to elect a mayor, I think would be an interesting idea. I don't know if you guys, just kind of your thinking on the 10%.
sure, and I had no idea what that threshold needed to be, so I pulled that out of the other statutes. We've got multiple different references in statute, and typically what you see is it ends up being either 5% of the total registered voters or 10% of the voters that voted in the last election. Now, I would agree, most of those protest petitions call for an election. They don't immediately stop some. Some do. But in this case, 10% of the voters in the last election, I think we specify that it's specifically the Secretary of State's race in the last general election. That could set out in an election. The problem with that election is it takes more time. It takes at least 45 days to have that election, and we start to run into problems with the calendar. And just my own, and you could obviously have your own opinion on this, if we called for an election and an election happened to increase taxes, that threshold that sets the election, that election's probably going to fail anyway, unless whatever the situation is. If there's a major incident in a jurisdiction that you need to build a new hospital or, whatever the situation might be, I would think that the voters would be understandable about that and would not probably protest that, but that's all speculation. So.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So 10% of the voters in that county or wherever from the last election. Is it, and if that is achieved, then this takes effect immediately? Okay.
That is the protest petition. If that threshold is met, they have to limit their budget to, as it's subsection B, they have to limit their budget to inflation plus the new growth.
And are there any requirements for who can get the petition off the ground? Do they have to file any paperwork or anything saying that this is what they're wanting to do? Do they have to have any language in the petition approved by anybody?
And I can't recall the statute right off the top of my head, but there is a statute that clarifies what has to be in petitions, and we reference that statute, I think, in the bill. And if not, there are specific things that need to be included in that protest
So those
petition.
things are already in place?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
One
Thank
thing that we do in this that is unusual is we allow a publicly held protest petition so people can go in. We define the county treasurers in the county to hold that petition in the bill as it currently stands. So people don't have to run down and chase down a petitioner that's circulating the petition. They know that they can go into the courthouse in the county treasurer's office, sign the petition, and it's good.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you. So if it does work, they get the petition numbers and the budget's held, is that the end of it for that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they cannot increase over the threshold.
Thank you.
Representative Clayton, I believe, was next.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Thank you for your presentation, and you did touch on this a little bit, but I hear from a great number of my municipalities in my area that they have these incredibly low mill levies. But can you talk a little bit more, especially as someone who served in local government? A low mill levy doesn't necessarily mean that they're not bringing in income, correct?
Correct. Your mill levy is a proportion, basically, of whatever your budget is divided by your total valuation. So if you live in a very, very high valued, you've got a lot of very high valued property, but the budget is relatively small compared to that valuation, you will have a small mill levy.
Thank you.
Representative Overkamp, did you have a question? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, on the $60 million, so that goes down to the counties based on population and then valuation, equalize, all that good stuff. And then once it goes to the county, then it goes to the different taxing entities based on the amount of taxes that they impose on their district. So got a little bit hesitancy on that because it's kind of rewarding cities or counties that already have high taxes, and it's punishing jurisdictions that already have lower taxes. Any thoughts on another mechanism for that?
Yeah, we had another bill in the committee not that long ago that addressed that exact situation. So honestly, I copied that language directly out of the LAVTR language on the distribution. One thing I do want to make clear is that money doesn't go to the treasurer's office to be distributed. This will come directly from the state treasurer to the county or to the city based on whether or not they qualified and were eligible for that payment. So it won't all go to the county to be distributed. It will be sent directly to, if the county isn't qualified and you have 5 cities and 4 of them aren't qualified, the one city that does gets their distribution.
Other question. So $60 million, and in the bill, does the full 60 get distributed each
No.
year? Or, okay, go ahead.
No, it does not. Based on whatever appropriation the legislature makes, the state treasurer's office looks at the data. It's split out. It's apportioned based on the population and valuation. And then they look at the taxes that are levied and they figured out what each payment for each city and county would be if they would all receive it. Those that qualify get the payment. The ones that don't, that money stays in the fund and it is swept and put back into SGF. I don't think there's a date secure in the statute, but it is, once all the distributions have been made, that money is put back into SGF. Then the next year it's subject to whatever the legislature appropriates.
Other questions, committee? Representative Kessler?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Just real quick on the petition side again. I mean, is there a process you got to open up a petition, or is this something that each county clerk or courthouse will, every year they'll have an open petition on the counter ready to go, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and we don't specify that in the bill. We don't have a petition, printed out and ready. We might be able to do that at the state treasurer's office or PVD or Department of Revenue, so they can just print that off. But under the provisions of the bill, the county clerk will be the first one to notify. Once they get all the budgets certified, the county clerks will know who is subject to that protest petition and who is not. They will give that information to the county treasurers, and if there's another petitioner that wants to individually go out and collect signatures, they can do the same thing. It might be a good idea to try to provide a form so people can just go online and print that off. But yeah, we don't really spell out the details of that petition. Again, there's a statute that kind of explains what should be in the petition, but maybe to keep things consistent and not require everybody to kind of pull up their Excel and make their own petition, we could just have something publicly available.
That was kind of what I was getting at. Is there something that we could do to make that process easier or smoother or automatic or whatever?
Yes, I certainly think we could.
I'll take my turn, and then we're going to go to Representative Corbett. But as you were talking about that, I was thinking about the truth in taxation required that those increasing taxes, that there was a notice sent to the residents so that they were aware of that. In this plan, how does the resident get notified of the increase in order to know there's a 30-day window for petition? Thank you.
Yes, when the county treasurer receives that, they have to post it on their website if they have one, and they also have to post it in the office, in the public office, either on a bulletin board or some type of notice, and then have that available. Other than that, it'll be up to the citizens to engage in the process and know whether or not that petition exists and go in and sign it. But there's no required notice, no publication notice. There's nothing that's required to be mailed out.
So likely it would hopefully be communicated by the media, but we don't know because most folks don't look at the website nor the postings, but fair.
Correct.
All right.
Yes.
Representative Corbett.
So for a timeline, once the budget's been, you had your budget hearing, you do the petition, and how much longer would you, once the petition either makes it or doesn't, before the state starts sending money back to the counties? What's your timeline on that?
Okay, so August 25th, in statute, August 25th, the budgets have to be certified. So that would essentially start the 30 days clock ticking. If the protest petition is successful and they have to limit their budget, if they went over what they were allowed to, those entities, those taxing entities have until October 1st to adopt a new budget and certify a new budget. I'm kind of drawing a blank on all the different timelines. I think the abstracts for the tax rolls have to be in by November 1st. I think the clerks have to certify those budgets to Department of Revenue by November 15th. And then that's when the state treasurer's office will get the information on how much has actually been budgeted. then the payments are going out that following January 15th is when they'll make those payments. So the taxing entities will know whether or not they're going to receive those payments, and they will be getting it at the very beginning of the fall, that year, that next year.
All right, I don't have any more on my list. Anything else, committee? Well, we've got the chair here. Okay, well, I'll say thank you. Oh, no, I'm sorry, Representative Carlin, my mistake. I did.
Well, no, I couldn't decide if I was going to ask this question, but I would like, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like very much for you to go back over that last part that you talked about qualifying who gets the money and others don't, and what goes back to the state general fund. And I get, it sounds like we're putting $60 million aside to be distributed to only to communities who have a protest petition?
No.
Okay, that's what I need. So in order to get the money, you say those who qualify, go back to that piece. What's the qualifications?
The qualifications, July 15th, every year, every city and county will get a notification from the state treasurer's office informing them what their threshold is. And that threshold is calculated by the prior year's taxes levied. And this only deals with property tax. It's not sales tax or any other revenue sources. It's just the property taxes that are levied, with a growth factor for inflation and a growth factor for new construction. So that's how they determine what that dollar amount is. Then if they adopt their budget and it's at that threshold or below, they automatically qualify for the distribution, their distribution amount from the $60 million. If they exceed that threshold, they no longer qualify for that payment, and they are now subject to that protest petition. So if, let's say your inflation factor and your growth factor is 3%, but the local government adopts a budget that provides for an 8% increase, they get that 8% increase if the protest petition fails. If it's successful, then they have to go back and adopt a new budget that is within those parameters, the 3%.
So that's how they qualify. That
Yes.
helps me a lot. I'll review it again. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Representative Long.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just as an example, the first year, let's say, cities and counties qualified to receive this money, 2/3 of them maybe for an exercise to the tune of $40 million. The other $20 million would be swept back into state general fund. Then the next year, it would have to be $60 million would have to be appropriated by the legislature plus 2%, right? And then you would start it over, and each year you would appropriate a different amount of money depending on who drew the money, right? Depending on...
It shouldn't depend on who drew the money. The fund is established disregarding how many people qualify or not. It's that $60 million the first year, and then it automatically goes up by the 2%. Whether everybody qualifies or nobody qualifies.
And so this creates a partnership between the states and local governments each year if the money's appropriated. And if it's not, then everything's null and void and it goes back to how it is now.
Correct.
Does it go back to revenue neutral?
No, revenue neutral policy is repealed. It doesn't go back to that. It's just that they aren't subject. If we don't appropriate the money, the protest petition is not possible.
Right.
So local governments could adopt whatever budget they want, and it would be possible.
Okay, but it goes on in perpetuity if we appropriate the money.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. So going off of Representative Carlin, when they go over their budget, the petition succeeds, they have to come back into their budget. Do they then get their money, or do they just forfeit it because they weren't there the first
They do
time?
get their money then, because they would be forced to adopt a budget that is at or below that threshold, which would then qualify them for that extra distribution.
I think they should just get half. They failed the first time.
We're trying to put a carrot at the end of the stick here, so encouraging good behavior.
A bit out of order. Representative Avercamp, did you have a quick follow-up to that conversation? Yes, Representative Essex, but okay. Representative Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So let's say this passes. How is it on the cities to educate this new protest petition? How, like, do they have to send out mailers? Like, will it be an unfunded mandate is what I'm asking. Who's going to educate the people on what the rate is and if there's a protest petition? How does that work?
There is no required notice that's to be published or mailed out. There's no unfunded mandate. There is a mandate that the county treasurers, once they receive who is eligible for those protest petitions, they need to post that on their website or, Facebook page or social media or whatever they have. I think in the law, we just said they need to post it on their website if they have one. We've had some situations where some don't have websites, so I wanted to make sure it was clear if they have one, and then they do have to post it, physically post it in their office. But other than that, there's no real notification requirement.
Now?
Yes, please.
Representative Avercamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for a city county that receives this money from the state, they've already set their budget, and they've set their levy, they've set their different, internal accounts and everything, and now they have this extra money. It's 2 questions. Is there any restriction on what the money can use for, which fund it would go into? And then the second question is, does that money get added to their, I guess it would get added to their budget somehow, but it doesn't get added to, how does it affect the next year's levied taxes and come into play there?
That's a good question because, yeah, you're right. It should be kind of theoretically accounted for, but that's why we want to provide every city and county kind of their approximate amount that they could receive from this, so they can kind of plan for that money to come in. It is designated in the bill. I think it's, do you want to help me out, Adam? I can't remember, but there are some essential services that it has to go law enforcement and some things like that. I can't remember what all is specified.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, that's correct. There is a provision on page 3, subsection E, where funds shall only be used for services including but not limited to roads and bridges, law enforcement, elections, public health and safety, or other services mandated by law.
And I would imagine it would be treated kind of like ARPA funds, where you don't really have to budget for it. This is money that's coming in, so you haven't had to levy taxes for it. It could potentially be audited if requested, and to make sure that it is being spent similar to the ARPA funds, but it should not impact the taxes that are levied for the next year because it was revenue. It was a different source of revenue, similar to if you had sales tax revenue or any other sources of revenue.
All right, anything else, committee? All right. Well, thank you for your additional
I
overview
like that seat
comments.
much better.
Do you want me to continue with asking for the fiscal note? Okay. Eddie Penner's going to go over the fiscal note.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Vice Chair and members of the committee. The fiscal note that you received is the letter from the Division of the Budget indicating that they're still waiting to hear back from one or more state agencies that they reached out to about this. That sometimes happens when bill hearings are scheduled relatively soon after the introduction of a bill. I don't actually know which state agency they may not have heard back from, because I believe they reached out to Revenue, State Treasurer, probably Department of Education, and then probably also the League and the Association for this one. But the fiscal note in terms of revenue to the state is the transfer amount, the 60 million plus the annual increase. I can't speak to if any of the agencies, I imagine State Treasurer might be the most likely candidate, would potentially have expenditures associated with this.
And I will make the comment, I did visit with the State Treasurer's Office extensively about this, and where this mirrors the previous demand transfer programs, they said it would be negligible fiscal impact to implement this, because basically they've got the program already in place. Any questions on the fiscal impact? All right, seeing none, we will finally get to the proponent section testimony. And welcome first to committee, Leah Fleiter.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. It's good to be here. I'm Leah Fleiter with the Kansas Association of School Boards. We support this bill as it's been introduced. We appreciate that transparency was the goal of the law that was passed in 2021, but we know, especially in the case of school districts, especially that revenue neutral rate notice that folks get, and then they focus on the 20 mills. And if you live in an area where there's any kind of property tax valuation, your 20 mills obviously shows that your tax, the revenue that raises is going up. And there's been a lot of misunderstanding on that, because it looks like the school district is tinkering with the 20 mills, and we don't actually have, as the chair noted, we don't have any control over that. 20 mills is a state mandate. It's pulled in and then it's distributed across the state. So that has been very confusing for a lot of folks, and has caused some hard feelings sometimes and some consternation. So we especially are sensitive to that, because we already, by state law, got a little close there. We already hold a budget hearing when we're getting ready to finalize our budgets. We publish our mill levy, we publish the date that we're gonna have the hearing, and we typically have that, say, at 5:30 or 6 on the evening when you're having your school board meeting, and the public is invited to attend and make any comments on the budget. And so we were already doing that, and then what the revenue neutral law, had the unintended consequence of affecting is that, there's a Wednesday in August or September when the board is holding their revenue neutral rate hearing at 5:45, and then they're holding their regular budget hearing at 5:50, and, for the same budget, and, for the same purpose. And so we certainly appreciate the chair bringing this bill forward, and we are in support of the provisions that apply to school districts. Do you want me to stand for questions now or later?
Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and take questions now, if there are any questions, committee.
Okay.
Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Next, I'd like to welcome Jim Carlskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, committee. I'm Jim Carlskin with United School Administrators. I can basically echo what Ms. Fleiter just shared with you. We understand understood and understand the intent of the revenue neutral rate, and as Ms. Fleiter indicated, schools were doing this before, long before 21, when revenue neutral was passed. We had to hold hearings. There was dates set, and the way that when revenue neutral came into effect, it really confused a lot of the patrons. A lot of explanations needed to take place. There was a lot of misunderstandings, and even with the technicalities that were brought in with the revenue neutral as far as being published and different things like that, it created a lot of consternation for school district personnel, whether it be superintendents, the clerks of the boards, and other things like that. So I won't repeat what Ms. Fleiter shared with you, but we also support the bill and the way it's written. And I don't understand as well as, Chairman Smith, what you talked about, the intricacies of this bill, but I appreciate you considering it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Representative Sanders?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So both you and Ms. Fleiter have indicated that the way it's been has been confusing. This sounds confusing too. So do you find this to be simpler?
From my from my standpoint, as a former superintendent, this would take back, as far as schools are concerned, go back to the way things used to be. Now, when it comes to cities and counties, I certainly understand what the intent of it and what you're hoping to accomplish. Will it be complicated to explain to them? Yes, I think it will.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carlskin, this might have been a question I should have asked Leah, but the local option budget that your school boards do have control over, do you recall, are those statutorily set? They do have some flexibility, and if they need to exceed a certain limit, they have to go to the voters to approve. I think it's a mill levy, not a dollar amount. Is that correct?
It's the mills, as well as capital outlay, Mr. Chair. Capital outlay, there's a max of 8 mills on capital outlay. The same with the LOB. And when you exceed a certain amount, or when you have the renewal, it has to be renewed. And if the board fails to renew it in a timely way, it goes to an election. Have to hold the election. So that in capital outlay and LOB, local option budget, they haven't changed any.
And that's maybe I failed to make that point clear when I was kind of explaining the bill. The reason I pulled schools and state levies out is because those are set in statute, the maximum limits. Now, a local school board on these provisions could elect to adopt a rate that's lower, but ultimately the legislature or the voters approve what that maximum mill levy is.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Okay. Any further questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome Aaron Mays. I don't think it's on.
How about now?
There you
Okay.
go.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman Smith, members of the committee. My name's Aaron Mays. My written testimony is not from me. It's actually from Jay Hall with the Kansas Association of Counties. Jay couldn't be here, so he asked me to stand in his place. We are standing in support of this bill. And while I think that there could be some improvements made to the bill, I think that this is a great step in the right direction. Part of the reason that I say that is because it does sort of reform a partnership between the state and local governments. The previous mechanisms for tax relief with the LAVTR and the city-county revenue sharing funds were not funded, and I feel like it really created a divide in the relationship between the state of Kansas and local governments. And I think this is a step towards getting those relationships mended. And I think that there's also some really good things in here about how this takes into account both economic growth in our communities and then also inflation as well. One of the problems that we've had with the revenue neutral rate as it is now is that it doesn't account for those things. It expects that a local government have the exact same budget year after year in perpetuity, and it's really just not realistic to expect that. And we've seen local governments throughout the state that might be able to do that 1 or 2 years in a row, but then end up raising taxes at a probably a larger clip than what they typically would have when they get themselves into a financial hole. And we feel like something like this would prevent that type of a scenario from playing out. And I think that if we have a pretty good understanding of, as local governments, when we have a pretty good understanding of what inflation has been and what the growth has been in our community, I think that local governments would be more likely to stay within those numbers, just given the parameters of this bill. So be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you would have this answer, maybe Jay wouldn't either, but, you know, the $60 million, I'll admit, was somewhat arbitrary. Has the Kansas Association of Counties ever tried to quantify the dollar amount of unfunded mandates, either at the federal or state level, the services that you provide that are essentially placed on the local taxpayers?
So they've been conducting a statewide survey of counties. Can't speak for municipalities, but it's incomplete right now. So there are still quite a few counties that have not completed the survey. They've got a list, I believe it's 18 services that counties are mandated by the state of Kansas to provide, and then they've asked each county to provide the line item budgets for those, and then they were hoping to aggregate that and bring it to the legislature, but it is not complete yet. I imagine that'll be on the website whenever it is done.
Okay, that would be interesting information to know. Committee, any questions for Commissioner Mays? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So has the Association of Counties had any discussions about, should this pass, how citizens are going to find out about this opportunity?
So county governments have weekly meetings to begin with. I mean, anytime we have a budget hearing right now, it's posted. I think this bill provides for the notification process of like what you'd have for a bond issue or a legal notice, where it would go to the media through the official county newspaper or the website. I believe the bill outlines the procedures. And I don't know about where you're at, but where we're at, I mean, word travels pretty quickly. Seems like it at least.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no further questions, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Last, I'd like to welcome John Donnelly with Kansas Farm Bureau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am John Donnelly with Kansas Farm Bureau. I'm here on behalf of them today. I'll spare you all the details. You've heard from me enough, but I'm going to, I guess, build on, since the chairman opened the door up to analogies, I'm going to build on that a little bit on this. You have my written testimony in front of me, but I guess as I've been around in this building, and this is previous to my time, was when LAVTR was put into effect, and I would say that that was the carrot. We thought that was going to solve our property tax problems. Well, I think if you look back, it would be argued that the carrot didn't work, so we got rid of the carrot, quit funding the carrot. We brought a stick. We brought a property tax lid. We brought a stick in there. This is going to fix our property tax problems, because every year, you've heard me say this before, every year after an election year, we hear property tax reduction is our #1 priority, and we never get it done. You've heard me this year talk about broad-based property tax relief. Well, so let me back up. So we brought the lid. Well, guess what? Didn't work. So then I would say revenue neutral rate came forward in whatever year we did that at. And let me also state that I supported all of these efforts, thinking that this was going to reduce property taxes. I guess what I would like in revenue neutral rate is to a lemon. Basically, we're going to put a lemon out there if we exceed the revenue neutral rate. And anybody that wants to come make us just suck on that lemon and listen to them complain about what we're doing, they can do that. They'll come in there and cut that lemon. And trust me, to Ms. Fleider's point, I've been to the school boards and I've done that before, and I brought an extra one and made them do it twice, because they do have to do that twice. So I think that's revenue neutral has been good, because it has allowed us to express our opposition when they are exceeding those expenditures. However, I do believe that this bill 2396 actually takes a more proper approach. It gets rid of the lemons. We don't have to suffer through that. You don't have to suffer some upset constituent like me showing up to the school board meeting and complaining about how much our property taxes, how high they are. But what it does provide is a carrot with a stick. It provides the funding that can help to reduce property tax relief, but it also allows the stick of the protest petition, and a 10% of the voters in that district or that taxing entity oppose that and show up and sign that petition, then it limits that budget to essentially inflation plus any new growth in the taxing jurisdiction. So I think there's that stick, but the other stick that's there that I think is a little bit glossed over, and I don't want to point the fingers at everybody because we're all involved in this process, we're all friends, but it also provides a stick for you. It says if you're not going to hold up your end of the bargain, then the local units of government don't need to do that. And it kind of goes to some of the unfunded mandates. We can ignore them, we can act like they don't exist, but they exist. There are services that are required by local units of government that are mandated from the state of Kansas. I know none of us like to think we would do that because we don't like it when the federal government does that to us, but we do it. That's how elected bodies work. So I guess what I would say is Farm Bureau is here supportive of this because we are looking for ways to reduce the property tax burden in the state of Kansas. We fully support the broad-based property tax relief that has been proposed in some other bills that you've heard us testify on, and you might be discussing later on today or in this week if I will end my testimony. But I do think that this provides the right balance, or at least as a starting point to the discussion to start the right balance of carrots and sticks to reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. So with that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Committee, are there any questions? Seeing none, your analogies must have worked, so thank you for your testimony. That concludes our verbal proponents. Is there anyone else wishing to appear as a proponent on House Bill 2396? Seeing none, I'll draw the committee's attention to written proponent testimony. Opponent testimony, we have, I believe it's written only, Michael Koss with Overland Park. Is there anyone wishing to appear before the committee as an opponent? If not, we'll move on to neutral testimony, and I have Spencer Duncan with the League of Municipalities.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee. Appreciate being here. Government Affairs Director for the League of Kansas Municipalities. I do understand all the carrot and stick analogies to some degree, but I don't really view it that way. I've stood in this committee previously and in others throughout this building, and what you've heard me say continually the last several years is we cannot continue to operate in silos where we each are sort of doing our own thing without understanding that when one of us does something, it impacts the other. The decisions you make here certainly impact local municipalities, and the decisions we make certainly impact the state. But for too long, we've each sort of been in our own corner figuring, well, if we just keep doing our thing, somehow magically they will mesh up and we'll solve the problem, which is why we're here. We haven't solved the problem yet, right? We view this bill as very much an acknowledgement, an understanding, and a true effort to say we are in this together. We both have to hold up our end for this thing to work, and we appreciate that approach. The only reason we are neutral, and if there was a giant meter and you wanted to put, positive over here, negative over here, we're really close to being proponents. But since this thing popped up 4 days ago and we like to truly vet things all across the state, we haven't had that opportunity, although we have talked to a lot of our cities. And I'm going to address their two big concerns that we'd like you to take a look at as you walk through this. But we are very supportive of this effort, and we believe it is because it understands the importance of working together on this tax policy to bring property tax relief to our citizens. The first amendment we would like to see does address the threshold issue of 10%. We understand why that was chosen. That is the traditional threshold that's used if you're going to trigger an election. But again, as was brought up earlier, there's no election that gets triggered here. This just simply becomes the decision is final. We would like to use the model that's closer to what happens a lot of times when it comes to planning and zoning petitions, which is 20%. We think that number's already something that's in local government, it's already something that's used, and it also increases that threshold since it's not pushing it to election. So that's our rationale for asking for that to go from 10 to 20. We didn't just pick it out of nowhere. We did look through a number that would work for the numbers themselves. We think it's still reasonable for the citizens and does have some precedent for petitions that are currently being done in our communities. The second thing that we would like it to be accounted for is bond payments. Some cities certainly tie some of their mills directly to the bonds they are paying, and some of those are voter-approved bonds. And I think, as someone said, maybe it was the chair, we don't want voters to have to go back and put a petition to get something they voted for, right, that could impact that. We think those are easy fixes. We're looking at some of the legal on the bond issue. So those would be our two recommendations, and really the two of the big early concerns we heard from cities as we discussed it with them. But overall, we're supportive. We very much appreciate this effort, and I'm always open to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Committee questions, Representative Alcala.
How you doing, Spence?
Good. We're about to find out.
No, so I'm a little confused. So how will this impact the distribution of sales tax between the joint committee, county and city, JETO, or will it?
It should not, because this really doesn't touch any of the sales tax collections or anything that's been voted on, any of the voter-approved local sales tax. And so sales taxes really are independent. They are really in their own bucket from property tax, so we don't envision this having any impact on that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I hope this makes sense. Forgive me. Say taxes are too high and they don't get the 20% protest. Now, who's going to be accountable? The county? Does that make any sense?
You mean accountable if the taxes can get you high?
Well, and they don't get the protest. They don't
So
get
if they try, so if they don't get enough signatures,
Yeah.
I think a couple things will happen, right? First of all, as cliche as it is, and I say this as a city councilman here in Topeka, they just vote me out next time, right? That's the first thing, right? But the second thing I think is, I do think once we go through this process the first time, everybody's going to know about it. And we saw that with revenue neutral. The first year we had those revenue neutral hearings and everybody was confused about it and they didn't understand the process. A lot of people didn't show up to the hearings. Year 2 and year 3, everybody understood it. They all knew when those hearings were. They all knew to show up. And I think there is going to be a learning curve with this process also after that first year where citizens say, oh, I heard now we can run this petition and we should go do that. I'm sorry we didn't do it the previous year. In terms of the accountability factor, if it's not successful, it's not successful. I would argue in a very biased fashion that it wasn't successful because citizens were okay with the budget we passed and they couldn't get enough signatures because nobody supported the petition. But that's my very biased perspective from this side of the...
Yeah, if it's not successful, it's not successful, but the county's lost some money because they didn't,
Yeah, but if it's not successful, it means that we set a budget that met what we believe were our needs, right? So I'm going to use total imaginary numbers. We've set a budget as a city that has a mill levy of 30 mills, right? Now, under this, if we had stayed in that revenue neutral plus CPI, again, making up numbers, let's say the mill levy would have been 26 mills, all right? You run the petition, I have to stay at 26 mills, plus I get the CPI if it's successful. If it's not successful, then I get to assess 30 mills, right? I mean, that's in theory how that would work, but the citizens understand that's a very simplified, very complicated issue. But I mean, so at that point, there's no loss to the county or the city. It's a choice the citizens and the electeds have made collectively to decide what that mill rate should be.
You say there's no loss, but yet they don't get any of that 60 million, do they?
No, but they won't. Under that scenario, it's not, they've determined they don't need it, right? Under the other, they've determined under your scenario that the city said, I don't need any money from the fund. I'm good where I'm at. So I'm not asking for money from that fund. That will happen, and not even because they'll raise the mill. We will have cities who set a mill rate that's still pretty close to that's not a significant increase and say, I don't need the money, we're fine. I know that sounds crazy, but that will happen.
Yeah.
Because that money doesn't fill the whole gap, right? It fills a percentage of it, but even if you decide to stay revenue neutral and take the CPI and make a request from the fund, it's not gonna fully fund what your quote-unquote gap would be. And that's okay. Cities are okay with that. It's just going to give you a little more on top so you don't have to raise the mill levy, which keeps the tax rate down for the citizens.
Yeah, I just can't see anybody saying, oh, we don't need that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
It does happen,
Well,
I swear.
What I might kind of reiterate on that is when they know what that payment amount will be, let's say the city or the county or whatever the entity is, they know that that payment is going to be $500,000, but yet they have needs in their community to where maybe they need $2 million, they will have to make that decision. Do we save up for 4 years and then do it in 4 years, or do we go ahead and forego that $500,000 and try to pass a budget that has all that in it? This will probably impact some behaviors of elected officials and their financial planning and what they choose to ultimately do, knowing that if they go too far, they lose that revenue, but it'll be up to the needs of the community. Okay.
And I trace that back to, honestly, Representative Auerkamp's comment, which we made earlier, but what's the incentive to keep it? And I argue the incentive is if I don't want a petition run against me, I'm gonna stay revenue neutral. I'm gonna take that CPI and I'm gonna call it a day and get into the fund. Then I don't have to worry about the petition process. It encourages me to keep my mill levy lower. And so I do think there's an incentive there to do that with this process.
Representative Auerkamp and then Alcala.
I forgot that part. Short-term memory loss. So do you have any thoughts, thank you, Mr. Chairman, do you have any thoughts on how the money gets divvied out to the taxing entities based on the amount of money that they're taxing, so that percentage base? Do you see running some real fast numbers here, and I could be doing bad math, but it seems like the counties get a very large percentage of the money because the counties also kind of tax city properties as well. So do you see maybe a better way to do that, or do you like that current?
So I'm not going to pretend we have totally figured out how this formula 100% works in the last 4 days or 5 days, all right? We have looked at it. I can tell you it really is county to county, city to city, based on sizes, all those variables that you are well aware of. So it's not a one size fits all, meaning I don't have a magic number that says every city will gain this or every city will lose that, which is why I believe our fiscal note sort of said it's possibly negligible because we don't necessarily see a huge loss for everybody. We see some gains for everybody else in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. So I don't have a good answer for that. I honestly think, this is scary, I know up here, and sometimes it's okay. We may, again, if we need to come back and adjust it, I think everybody in this building and cities and counties are gonna be willing to sit down after a few years and say, that percentage could use a tweaking one way or the other, and then we can go from there. But I think based on the numbers we've seen and that cities have done, this formula is okay. I mean, that's the short version, is the quick math the smart people have done. It's not the worst thing they've seen, let's put it that way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And as I learn more, as we get that data, because we're still asking cities to figure out, we'll pass it along to you. We will. I mean, I also think what you're going to see more often than not, it could be wrong, we've always said, as it relates to the revenue neutral process itself is, if this doesn't happen and you start to look at that process, simplest fix to revenue neutral is revenue neutral should be revenue neutral plus the CPI. And I think you'd see more and more cities, just because that's built into here, staying revenue neutral more often than not, because that's all cities need sometimes. Our costs went up 1.5%. We just need to capture that. We don't need to capture the rest. And so I think that piece in here helps this bill a lot to encourage cities to just stay there, never need a protest petition. And I think if revenue neutral rate itself under the current law was that definition, you'd also see a little bit of a difference with cities being able to stay more revenue neutral.
Representative Alcala.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Spence, I'm going to run through a scenario, and then you can correct it if I'm wrong at the end. I raised the same questions that Representative Haberkamp has over there about the amount of money that will be distributed to the municipality. I think if you go through the petition process and then there's a cap, or you stay revenue neutral, then I think it's going to start affecting services, and I can only talk about Topeka. I think it's going to start affecting services. So when that happens, there'll have to be cuts or reductions at the municipality level, which means that representatives that sit on city councils can come back and say, hey, blame your state representative because they implemented HB 2396. I may be wrong, but I see that. And instead of this bill, I always thought that maybe the cities should start controlling spending along with the counties. I see we did a relief of food sales tax up here And I'll be damned if the city's not coming along and want to raise the sales tax to close that gap. So any money that we pass to save when you purchase groceries, they want to add a sales tax back on to the voters to help offset costs and infrastructure. This sounds, maybe I don't understand it, but if I'm off base there, correct me, because I am curious to hear what you think about that.
So I think a couple things are true. First of all, just for the record, we totally rejected as a city council that sales tax proposal. We said, no. Just as much as I said after the first year, people may learn this process exists and they can do it if they want to keep it low. I do give citizens a lot of credit. They are smarter than we sometimes as electeds want to give them credit for, right? If they run a petition and the first conversation we have to have after a year or two is to exactly to your point, great, I'm going to follow this, but I told you I needed to give all of my police officers, which happened in Topeka, a raise to get us up to market value, which was the tune of $6 million new dollars, which is why we face a budget deficit in part next year. I'm going to have that tough conversation with citizens. And they're going to have to understand, you ran the petition, we're going to stick to this. This is what it means. This is what the budget looks like. We're going to do it. We're going to make the best of it as a city, but you helped us make that decision, so you now have skin in the game. Welcome to the governing part of this process. And I think that's it's another way to educate people on how the budget works and what the consequences of some of these decisions are both ways. And it works both ways. We have to learn from those consequences too at times as elected. So I really wouldn't be up here neutral and leaning positive towards this if we thought it was going to lead to some of your concerns. Now, none of us have a crystal ball. I don't know what it's going to look like to some degree, right? But we do believe this is a workable system that is trying to meet the needs of everybody, give the cities the revenue they need, and reduce those property tax bills. So we do think that in our early analysis of this bill.
And the reason I bring that up is, and my wife sits on city council, so she's, the same boat you are, except she votes no, you vote yes. But the city of Topeka, and here's what concerns me, it really does. I mean, we laugh, but it's serious. So we spend all this money and vote on a hotel that we've invested billions or millions of dollars in, and yet we're up here wanting to pass 2396 because that tells me that we're not accountable and can't control spending at the municipality level. So do you not think that controlling spending at the municipality level, being able to pick and choose what services you can keep or reduce versus this bill is not going to be better? Or do you think that you'll get more revenue generated from 2396 than without it?
All right, well, so it's just you and me talking here, right? Let's be honest.
I've known you a long time.
The revenue neutral process as it exists today has been very beneficial in educating the public about the process. The statistic also tells us the majority of cities exceed revenue neutral, right? That's just a fact, all right? Because to the point I made earlier, if I right now it's either or. I either stay revenue neutral and I'm locked into this when I got expenses going up, or I have to exceed it because I need to capture that other couple of percentage where the world prices went up in the world, all right? That's the only two options I have under the current process. So 9 times out of 10, we say I'm exceeding it. This gives me an option now. This gives me that third option to say I can stay revenue neutral and capture that percentage, or I'm not going to, and now the citizens have a direct input into whether they think that was the right decision or not. And so that's how I view it from that lens of it finally gives me a new option that the current revenue neutral process system simply does not.
And I'm not saying, Mr. Chair, I'm not saying that citizens shouldn't have input, but what I'm saying is that we wouldn't be here if the elected officials controlled spending. So.
I guarantee you there are just as many citizens of Kansas who believe that about this legislature as they do about their local government,
well,
right?
It's not
but that's the balance and the issues we face every day,
it's
right?
not tit for tat. There's 125 of us up here. There's only 9 of you.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's the difference.
No, I understand. But that's the elected official's dilemma, right?
Thank you, Spencer.
Any further questions, committee? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But one of the first things you said was that you'd be in favor of raising the threshold to 20% from 10%. That seems like you want to make it twice as hard for the taxpayers to
No,
take
we're
advantage.
looking at the numbers game, and I have to go, I'll go back and look, I can look at some cities, but knowing somewhere where your district is, I believe in some of the cities you represent, that could be as simple as like 100 people. And so, because it's the percentage of people, I believe, who voted in the Secretary of State's election in that voting district. So if I've got a city that has 1,400 people and 1,000 of them voted, 10% is 100 people. So,
Yeah, but I've got a city that has almost 50,000 people, and
I
I don't
understand.
represent all of them.
No,
but
I understand, but I'm just giving you a number, a perspective of some of the city's concerns was, I am a duly elected official, and now I've got 100 people out of 1,400 population who've signed this and made this decision. Be nicer if that threshold was a little higher, since it's not triggering an election. It's okay to disagree with that thought process, but I want you to understand that's been some of the feedback we've gotten.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Corbett and then Carlin.
Following up on the last comments, you should make it as easy as possible for the people who are writing the checks to protest the problem. And if you're afraid of the protest, then raise it to 20 or 30%. But if you're proud of your product, I think 10% is fair.
Representative Carlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would, before I would support a 20%, I would certainly like to see where we are currently in the most recent petition laws that have been passed in the state. Back in 1992, I brought in a petition law change because of spending that, So I'm kind of following some of this, but I believe at the time we were trying to decide whether it should be 3% or 5% of the people who voted in the last Secretary of States. So when I heard 10%, I go, whoa, but I would like to know where other laws are, where we are, what's our standard today? And I don't know if the reviser or the research person would know today on that, or if they could get back to us on that, because we should be in line with other petition laws if we do this.
Yeah, when I was drafting the bill, I researched that a lot. I'm sure the reviser could put a list together maybe by tomorrow. I don't want to commit him already, but there are multiple instances of protest petitions in statute. Maybe we could do a little bit of research and provide you some context with that. Okay. Any further questions, committee? Representative Francis.
Mr. Chair, just one question. Most of the other protest petitions go to the point where they require an election to be afterwards, don't they?
Most do, yes.
Okay.
He was asking whether most of the other protest petitions in statute call for a vote, a special election. They aren't the final word per se. Most of them do. There are some that put a stop to whatever the proposal is, but majority of them do call for an election. So, committee, any further questions? Representative Kessler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That actually kind of makes sense. At 10% to call for election, but if you have an initiative going on in your city and 50% of the people are in favor of it, but it takes 10 to wreck it. I mean, so that's another thing to kind of think of. At least an election would bring everybody out, right? At 10%, not a big deal, but I just kind of see that there might be a situation where you have something going on that the vast majority of the people of the jurisdiction wants to do this, and then it just takes a small fraction of people to kind of throw a wrench into it. So I don't know what that balance is, but yeah.
All right, seeing no further questions, I think you might have stood up there longer than I did. So.
You know.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
All right, we do have some neutral testimony written by Jamie Doss of Saline County. Is there anyone else wishing to appear before the committee as a neutral on House Bill 2396? Seeing none, we will close the hearing. On House Bill 2396, I realize the hour is getting late, but I would like the committee to take a look at Senate Bill 35. We heard that, I think it was last week. I might turn to the reviser for a summary on that bill, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 35 would discontinue essentially the state levied 1.5 mils for the Kansas Educational Building Fund and the State Institution Building Fund. This would occur after the current tax year of 2025. It would also provide for financing, essentially backfilling the funds. Under Section 1, would remove or discontinue the state tax levy of 1 mil. Section 2 would transfer $56 million from the state general fund to the Kansas Educational Building Fund. And then starting in 27 and thereafter, the transfer would be increased in an amount equal to the immediately preceding year plus the percentage equal to the average percent change in statewide taxable valuations of all property for the preceding 10 years. Section 3 would discontinue the 0.5 mils for the benefit of the state institutions in carrying of certain persons. And then Section 4 would backfill that with $25 million transferred from the SGF, and then on 2027 and thereafter would be increased by an amount of 2% of $25 million.
Thank you, Adam. Committee, any questions for the reviser on the bill? Seeing none, we are open for discussion. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion. Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we pass out SB 35 favorably.
Do we have a second? Representative Turner with a second. Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion carries. All right, committee, that does conclude our business for the day. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We are adjourned. Representative Helgerson for an announcement.